Welcome everyone to the E-Institute's World Bank E-Institute's webinar on Right to Information and Overview in 12 countries. I'm Victoria Lemieux, Senior Public Sector Specialist here at the bank, and I'm very pleased today to have with us Stephanie Trapnell, whose bio I will now read to you so that you can get a sense of Stephanie's deep expertise in the subject of right to information. So Stephanie is a specialist in open government and accountability. She's engaged in the development of measures for transparency, accountability, and outcomes, and the sustainable implementation of learning and participatory processes for performance monitoring. She's the research manager of the Public Accountability Mechanisms Initiative at the bank and is a co-author of the publication Public Office, Private Interest, Accountability Through Income and Asset Disclosure. She's also the editor of a forthcoming volume of country studies on access to information entitled Right to Information, Case Studies on Implementation, which you'll be able to download from the Transparency and Information Management website of the bank. And she's currently pursuing her PhD in sociology at George Mason University, just because she has nothing else to do. And she holds an MA from Johns Hopkins University already, at the School of Advanced International Studies. So Stephanie, welcome, and we're so very pleased to have you with us today and for all your work on investigating right to information implementation. So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Vicki, for being here. I'm going to talk, as it's on the title, the overview of 12 country case studies. In particular, we're going to talk about drivers of effectiveness that we found when we did our qualitative analysis of the 12 case studies. So, yes, so the first slide, it shows where right to information laws actually exist in the world. In fact, 100 countries now worldwide have an RTI law, which makes it over 50% of the world. And the most recent one was, I think, last month. That was Paraguay. Only 30 years ago, there were only 10 laws in place. So this is a phenomenon that has happened in the last 30 years. Ongoing implementation challenges when RTI laws are put into practice, they're still challenging the implementation process. So typical problems that we see are the reporting on requests and appeals are not consistent. The oversight bodies are weak. There are persistent cultures of secrecy that prevent disclosure. Information is poorly managed and hard to find. This relates to records management, and that's a case in all the case studies. I'll talk about that later. Citizens remain unaware of their rights and how to make use of them. So these are the types of challenges that are still characterizing implementation processes for right to information. And in practice, we have 3 different areas that people normally look at when they're trying to understand the types of challenges that people are facing when they're implementing. There is the implementation, which is also known as the plumbing or the mechanics. And this is when provisions of laws are fully implemented and the mechanics are operational. That would be effective implementation. Compliance is also referred to as performance, and that includes the responsiveness to requests, the appeals, and the timeliness. Basically, it's the extent of compliance with the statutory provisions to release information. And then we have impact, which is much further down the results chain. It's the nature and extent of change that has occurred because of RTI, and that's much more difficult to capture. What we're focusing on in this study is implementation effectiveness, and we're defining it as when laws achieve their objectives or meet their projective outcomes in practice. Objectives can be set by any number of people. It varies depending on the stakeholder, government, civil society, international donors, etc. Because of the diffuse nature of transparency and accountability mechanisms, RTI systems can achieve any number of outcomes. We have chosen these 3 in particular because we're focusing on accountability and development outcomes. So they're titled degree, first degree, second degree, and third degree, which reflects how far removed they are from the system. So it doesn't mean that they happen first, second, and third. They're just first degree outcomes are reflections of information disclosure, which is the performance of the government, their responsiveness to demand for information, and there are a lot of different indicators that go into that outcome category. Second degree outcomes involve different actors because it's about information usage for accountability in particular. And this is where civil society becomes involved in this. Strategic use of RTI to establish accountability measures and or improve operational efficiency. Different areas, service delivery is included in that. And then third degree outcomes, which are further down the line and involve a lot different parts, different moving parts. The institutionalization of information access, which is a shift in the bureaucratic culture of secrecy. And then we also have improved development outcomes, gender equality, standards of living, health and education. And there's more work being done, particularly in health and education, about the impact of RTI, and that those results are going to be exciting. They're coming in the next few years. So we wanted to move beyond responsiveness, which is the first degree outcome, because there are problems with the data. The data are missing. The data lack reliability. We're not sure if governments are effectively collecting the information. Data do not answer important questions about effectiveness in context, and they might even be misleading. So there are types of questions that these data don't answer, such as what drives request submission? What drives approval rates? Which agency approves requests more often and why? What drives the number of appeals? These are the kind of questions that are going to help you understand whether the performance of the government is meeting its targets, and this is not what's being collected at the moment. So we wanted to move beyond responsiveness. This is a chart just to show you the types of data that are collected and where the gaps are. There are clearly gaps in a lot of different places, a lot of different countries. So just to show you that it is hard to collect this kind of data. So our methodology for this paper is called thematic synthesis. Basically, it's a structured approach to the synthesis of large amounts of qualitative data. And it incorporates mechanisms for the reducibility of findings. It's not a subjective approach. It is as objective as it can be when we're working with qualitative data. That was very important for us. It's partly phenomenological, which means that it's the objective study of subjective narratives. These are country case studies, and they're written by authors who, and any kind of case study is going to have limitations. So we're trying to take a step back and find ways for our data to be reliable so that it might be generalized and it can be used for other studies. The 12 country case studies that we used were Albania, India, Jordan, Mexico, Moldova, Peru, Romania, South Africa, Thailand, Uganda, United Kingdom, and United States. And here's some of the characteristics of the countries in the sample. You can see that the oldest law that we have in this sample is the United States in 1966. It actually I think it didn't come into effect until the 70s. But the youngest law we have is Jordan at 2007. So there's a range of countries, a range of ages of laws. There are different population sizes, different GDP, the state, federal versus unitary. It comes into play when we're talking about subnational implementation processes, and also different political systems. We wanted a range of countries to look at so that we could generalize a little bit better. So intercoder reliability results. Intercoder reliability is when we had external coders go through the text and code the text that we had coded to see if our codes matched with their codes. And you can see that this is an example on the bottom of the coded text, coder 1, coder 2, and the index coder, which is the primary coder for the project. So the coding, when we went through and coded the qualitative data, we produced an average of 260 references per country case, which was a lot. The actual country cases were about 650 pages of text. The reliability results resulted in a 92% matching. And 30% of the time, the external codec suggested additional nuances in interpretation, which helped us to better flesh out our findings. Here's a sample of the codes, the prevalent codes that came up a lot. They're grouped into 3 categories right here. There are formal practices, and within that, there was appeals process came up, implementing rules, proactive disclosure, records management, and request process. And then we have the category policy prioritization. Agency leadership came up quite a bit, as did political support, as key factors in implementation processes. And the third category is accessibility. And these are the types of barriers to accessibility that came up quite a bit. Corruption, costs, CSO assistance, whether it was there or not, intelligibility of the disclosed material. Is it easy to understand, for example, or was it written and organized for a civil service audience only? Proactive dissemination And the informality of the request process came up quite a bit when in situations where request processes were not formalized. So here's the schema that emerged from our codes. We've grouped them into 4 domains of RTI implementation. This is very high level. I'm going to go into the different domains in a second, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So the first domain was enabling conditions, and that involves the law. It involves advocacy by civil society, and it involves policy prioritization by the government. The second category is demand for information. Is often overlooked when governments think about implementation processes, but it's a key part of the puzzle. And that it includes public knowledge of RTI and also the accessibility. The third domain is very key. It's the administrative operations and how RTI is institutionalized within the public sector. So it's sort of the main part. If you don't have administrative operations, then you can't disclose the information. And the fourth category is oversight, which includes both monitoring and enforcement. So our first category, enabling conditions, we found that the structure and the quality of the law mattered when it's implemented. It could be a great law on the books, but if it isn't implemented, it doesn't make any difference. So when we looked at when it was implemented, and some of the key areas were deadlines that were missing and the basis for appeals. Those mattered quite a bit in implementation processes. Another driver was advocacy efforts, and this is civil society's involvement in RTI implementation. So there are 4 different areas where we saw that civil society played a role and that mattered for how implementation, the path of implementation. In particular, involvement in the passage of the law was key to sustained civil society engagement. If civil society actors were not involved in the drafting of the law or discussions about the content of the law, they didn't actually enter later to help with implementation processes. Another category was lobbying for and against amendments, and nearly all of the countries we looked at had civil society actors that were lobbying for and against amendments. Another area was strategic litigation. Not every country had civil society actors working on strategic litigation. There are 2 big barriers to that. One is the expertise that's required, and we need effective courts for strategic litigation to make sense, for people to put the effort into it. And the fourth category was active monitoring of implementation by civil society. And this was the least frequent engagement process by civil society actors, because it takes a lot of effort to collect data, to analyze it, and then to disseminate it. The third category for enabling conditions was policy prioritization. And the 2 big things that came out of that mattered for implementation were support from political actors, which is not surprising, key types of support. It must not just be lip service. They can't just talk about it. They actually have to devote funds to it. That's very important. And the second was strategic and operational leadership at the level of the public body. That's directors and managers that are working on the operations of right to information. They need to set the tone for their agency, for RTI to actually be implemented effectively. So the second domain was demand for information. As I mentioned earlier, this is about the public awareness of users. It's not just about NGOs, it's about the users of the information. And there are 2 broad areas of public awareness. There's the technical process of how to request the information, and there is also the broad knowledge of what exactly could you request, what does the government have that you need. And this was found, at least half of the countries had done citizen surveys of the knowledge of citizens about RTI and found that it was quite low. And that drives demand. So if the users don't understand where to get the information or what to get, demand will be low, and then that will affect administrative operations. Formalization will be much slower, and it may not take place at all because there's no need for it. The second category, these codes came up, the accessibility of RTI processes. How well can people access the actual process of getting information from the government? And there are serious barriers. Petty corruption was a major barrier that came up again and again. having to pay bribes to get information just to push your request through. The informality of the process, you need to know certain people. And this is important for journalists. They need to have informal ways of getting information quickly. And this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about informality that characterizes the entire right to information process for requesting information. There was also absence of information officers that hadn't been appointed, so people did not know where to submit their requests. That was more prevalent than you might think. And then there were language differences as well, particularly in South Africa, where guides were not written in languages that people could understand, and so they didn't understand how the process worked. The third big domain is administrative operations, and here we're talking about request processing, proactive disclosure, and records management. And all these three big subdomains of administrative operations is what the case studies looked at. And there were 5 big drivers of effectiveness in these areas. In particular, intragovernmental collaboration was important, and it's something that's often overlooked. It was mentioned in several case studies as being the reason for RTI processes being moved along more effectively. For example, right to information officers and records management managers often don't talk, and then you have the problem of not being able to find the information. You also have intragovernmental collaboration across public bodies so that RTI officers can talk to each other as sort of like a community of practice, and that was also very helpful. Updated formal practices refers to the formalization of practices within the public sector. So not everybody knows what they're supposed to do if they have a task related to right to information. They're implementing rules, there are guidance documents, there are flow charts so that you understand how to implement your responsibilities effectively, and it's not left up completely to the discretion of the officer. Staffing levels were important. Oftentimes they hadn't filled positions or there was staff turnover. Political appointments figured heavily into staffing levels if the turnover was high. Staff capacity involves training and resources. And this is a big one. Every single country in the sample cited training and resources as an obstacle to getting effective implementation in place. Training in particular, interestingly enough, it came out that the best systems were actually had a central oversight agency that was working with local human resources department to implement training courses. It wasn't a centralized system. It was much more effective to do it within the agency itself. And the final category is staff incentives. Our staff, when they are given extra responsibilities for right to information, are they given appropriate reward? Are they given appropriate time? Is it part of their performance evaluation? Do they have guidance? Are there no whistleblower protections in place, or are there serious sanctions for making mistakes and disclosing information incorrectly? These are all the types of incentives that mattered, and they mattered in every single case. And the fourth category we have is oversight. This is both monitoring and enforcement. And monitoring is a catch-all word. It involves several different tasks. One of those is performance monitoring. Collecting the data, telling sort of guiding the public bodies on what kind of data they need to collect, getting it from them, analyzing it, and then putting out guidance documents based on that data. There's also implementation support, which is usually done by a nodal agency within the public sector. When it's part of government, it makes it easier for the nodal agency to interact with public bodies, as opposed to an external information commissioner that may be situated outside government as an oversight body. A nodal agency is normally within sort of like the Department of Personnel or the Department of Justice in the United States. And they're there to provide guidance documents, to set out implementation rules, and also help with problems that are arising. There's also implementation oversight, and that involves making sure that agencies are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that is closely tied to performance monitoring. And then there's public outreach. You'd be surprised that only 4 countries in the sample mandate public outreach by the government. Most of them leave it up to civil society or the individual agencies. But that is something that's involved in the monitoring part of administrative operations. And then we have enforcement of disclosure obligations. And there were 5 big areas of enforcement that came up when we were coding. And these related to enforcement effectiveness. It wasn't clear which ones worked better, but they all were working to some effect. So the first one was an effective appeals process, including the courts. Our appeals accepted, received, reviewed, and our decisions made in good time. And then the second category was binding decisions by the enforcement body. When the enforcement body makes decisions, are agencies required to act on those decisions, or is it sort of like a recommendation? Binding decisions by far were more important to enforcement. Then there was credible threat of sanctions and fines. Most countries did not have a credible threat of sanctions. There were other ways of enforcing. And the fourth category is one of these alternatives. Persuasion, mediation, investigation. Sometimes it's simply talking and establishing channels of communication that actually improved implementation processes. The threat of investigation sometimes works, but most often it was persuasion and mediation tactics between oversight bodies and public agencies that worked the best. And the fifth category was public release of data on poor performance. Almost all countries did this, but whether it actually helped with enforcement varied. And in fact, it was quite a weak method of enforcement. And then we have these 2 magnifier effects that sort of cut across all the domains. And it came up again and again and again in all the case studies. State-society collaboration. And by this, we mean engagement between civil society and the government that's not adversarial. It's not advocacy. It's about partnerships and joint efforts to produce outcomes. So it includes working groups, stakeholder consultations, participation in committees and councils, these kinds of things. These activities went a long way to improving implementation effectiveness when they're used. It's a difficult sort of tack to take because oftentimes the communication between the 2 groups is not great, but establishing it, once it's established, it works really well in practice. And then the other magnifier effect is technology. But technology must be suited to the needs and interests of users. It can't just be adopted best practice-wise and implemented. You have to understand the context in which you're using the technology for it to work well. And our conclusions about the key drivers of effectiveness, drivers are not just about the mechanics of implementation. It's not just about plumbing, although that is very important. Administrative operations and the plumbing of the public sector is key. It's fundamental to a right to information system. But for effectiveness, there are other areas that you need to look at. So the structure of the law impacts implementation directly. The legal framework is essential. The roles and relationships of key actors and institutions influence that implementation path. So you have civil society actors, you have citizens, you have international donors, political actors, and bureaucrats within the public sector. All of these actors are involved in the implementation path. The institutionalization or the formalization of key RTI processes is paramount. This is what I was talking about with informality. Informality works in some circumstances, but it shouldn't characterize the entire right to information system. There needs to be processes and practices that are laid out and clear to everybody involved for the system to function effectively and efficiently. Incentive structures are really important. They should include disclosure and practices that enable disclosure, e.g. good records management. Incentives came up again and again and again in different forms. And if you read the paper, which is coming out next week, you'll see the different types of incentives that actually, the disincentives that are in place that serve as barriers to implementation. And then we have the informal norms of government officials and society at large about secrecy, who owns the information and who should get the information, about empowerment, what should you do with the information, and voice and agency. These informal norms characterize a lot of the challenges with right to information, but they're not barriers that can't be overcome. They're certainly there, but they can be worked with. Technology is a magnifier effect and a confounding factor. You can't simply set technology up and expect it to make miracles happen. This is particularly in the case of digital records management. Digital records management, and Vicky can talk about this if it comes up. Digital records management is a lot more difficult, more complex than it sounds. There's a lot of moving parts, so it needs to be considered carefully. And that is the end. Thank you very much for joining. And Vicky is going to take over now, and we're going to move on to the next part. Okay.
All right. Here we are. Okay. Well, wonderful. Stephanie, let me begin by thanking you very much for that presentation. There's a lot of rich information in there. I think you learned a lot from those case studies, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. We'll now begin with some poll questions, and while we're doing the poll questions, also I'd invite you, all of you who have joined us online, to think about your own questions and post them to the chat area on the site so that we can respond to your questions as well. So we'll begin with the first poll question, which is about how right to information effectiveness can best be evaluated. This is what the work that Stephanie has been doing is involved with. So we wanted to find out from you what you thought about how to best evaluate effectiveness. Would it be analysis of data on numbers of requests and appeals and how these have been handled? Or perhaps analysis of data on the mechanics of implementation, such as whether there's an information commissioner and whether records management is in place? Or analysis of studies on how information that is requested by individuals or groups of individuals in society is used, so impact analyses, or analysis of the kind that we've done, analysis of reports within countries with the lived experience of the operations, people talking about RTI implementation and its effectiveness, and trying to unpack that from multiple perspectives. So we just want to get a sense of you, from you, what you think is the best way. So I think we've got some numbers in on that question, and it looks like most of you feel that we really need to look at impact analysis of studies on how information that is requested by individuals or groups of individuals in society is used and the results of that use. So Stephanie, I wonder if you that's not the approach we've taken here, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on the fact that the majority of voters have suggested that, well, we think really the impact analyses are the better way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, impact is very important, and everybody is very interested in impact. It's just very difficult to collect valid, reliable information about impact because it's about what you think the projected outcomes are supposed to be and measure against those. Hopefully in the next few years we'll have more information about impact, particularly in service delivery. But I do think that what we've done and what the Carter Center is working on the plumbing part of it, I think these are the foundation for the system itself. If you don't have the system, you can't have impact. So it's important to understand how the system is actually working and whether it's effective. And when you have impact stories, linking them together and finding out what works and what doesn't. So you need sort of both parts of the puzzle in order to really help implementation processes along.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, and I was really taken by your slide where you show the first degree outcomes, second degree outcomes, and third degree outcomes. And it really struck me that in order to get to what I think we're getting at in this, the third, the response that most of the voters selected, is that third degree outcomes. We want to know what that is going to look like, but we really need to understand the first degree outcomes first. And so I thought, that made a lot of sense to me. So our next question then is going to be about the most important driver of right to information effectiveness. So we wanted to find out, what do you think? And so our selection of a range of answers is structure of the law. Is that the most important thing? The values and incentives of public officials? Or is it demand from citizens, civil society organizations, and the media? Or is it establishing the government institutional and procedural arrangements to disclose information? Or is it some other factor? And it seems like the votes are just coming in still. So we'll give it a couple more minutes here before we close the voting. And getting some results here. So that's great. So About 9% of you said you think it's values and incentives of public officials, that's the most important factor. 36% approximately said, no, it's really about demand from citizens and civil society organizations. And then about 54% said it's really about making sure that you've got the institutional framework, the government procedural arrangements, and so on in place. So, Stephanie, these are some interesting results.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on these?
I'm surprised. It's interesting that values and incentives of public officials weren't the tops because weren't at the top because most people talk about cultures of secrecy and how that impedes implementation. It's a big topic of discussion. And it's nice to see that demand from citizens is being noticed because it's often overlooked when you're talking about laying out the implementation path and the strategy for implementation. Demand is key. If you don't have demand, the system's not going to work. You don't have any reason to supply. And I would agree that the fourth one, the establishment of government institutional and procedural arrangements are key to sort of like the foundation. If you don't have this, you don't have much with right to information. But it's interesting how it spread across those answers.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I guess, we can maybe equate right to information to a complex system like a human body. You and I were talking the other day. Administrative systems, maybe that's like the head.
Yeah.
If you don't have one, it's hard to operate.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So our third question is really looking at the methodological approach, and we wanted to ask you, really, do you think that we can generalize about what matters to achieving RTI effectiveness from the kind of synthesis that we've attempted to do in this study? And so we just wanted to find out from you, what do you think about taking this kind of an approach? And maybe you can tell us if you think there are other approaches in the chat feedback. So we'll finish up with this poll. So if you'd like to vote now, we'll start to pull the answers. Got the results coming in. Okay, so a good number of you, about 91% of you, felt that yes, you can generalize from these kinds of syntheses of case studies. And about 10% roughly or so said that they didn't really think that you could generalize from the studies. But I guess I'm pretty happy to see that, over 90% think that you can generalize. What do you think, Stephanie?
Oh, I think it's encouraging. Yeah, because there are methods to do qualitative analysis to ensure reliability so that there is some measure of generalization. And we took pains to do this, and when the paper comes out, you'll see the methodology section is quite robust. We want everyone to understand how we did it, how we came across it. It wasn't just picking and choosing. We had a process that we went through to come up with these findings. We didn't just look at them and pick what we liked. So yeah, it's great that they
that viewers feel that this is a valid approach. And I guess we have to look at different methodologies. This can complement other approaches that we might use, like randomized controlled trials, statistical methods, gathering right response data, and so on. So I think really the answer is to try and combine all of the different approaches to really try to understand the phenomena of right to information and how it operates in society and what the effect is and what the impact is. But these kinds of case studies can be very good at getting at things that statistics don't tell you, right? About context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's important. Context is important.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So this stage, I think, are we ready to ask some questions here, or answer some questions from the viewers? So let me start with a question from Abdelaziz Abib, and Abdelaziz is from Morocco, and he's talking about considering request size. I'm just going to read it out. The question: considering request size. So 4 to 24 per 10,000 person, I think 10,000 people per year, which seems maybe low. He's asking, about the reliability of the data, essentially. He's saying, I wonder if it's a question of accuracy, that is to say, they're underestimated, Is it due to freedom of information request procedures, or is it due to an inclination from other sources than FOI? What's going on with the data, Stephanie?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And in fact,
Yes.
it's a pretty stable population that does requests. It's less than 1% per country. And in countries where they've tried to do some research on the requester profile, like Mexico, they're finding that it's an urban white male elite, actually professionals, that are making these requests, which is it's an important population, but it's not the entire population that we would hope to be using the right to information process. So there is always a question of accuracy and the internal tracking mechanisms in any institution, any system, but it actually is quite low and in practice.
Yeah. So we have a couple of other questions here, Stephanie, and I wanted to ask you about how long should a law be implemented in a country so that you can really get a sense of RTI effectiveness?
Yeah.
Does it matter, do you think?
Well, Brazil passed their law quite recently, and it's quite a robust system. And there are some systems, you'll see in the case studies, where they passed them 20 years ago, and they're not robust yet. So time actually does matter. You need to give it a few years to get running, but it doesn't take 10 years to effectively implement right to information. It's more like 1 or 2 or 3 years from the case studies and from general knowledge of the RTI laws.
Do you think it's the same for all countries, though? Do you think that there are things going on in countries like one of your domains is the enabling environment?
Yeah.
So what is it about the enabling environment that may hold back implementation and maybe make it longer, do you think, to implement?
Well, certainly resources. If there's not any funding for the process to take place, if agencies can't find the funding from their existing envelope, then it's not going to be put into place very well. But there's also the measure and nature of political support for the RTI process. It's not enough just for politicians to say that RTI is really important. Processes need to be put in place so that RTI can be effectively implemented within agencies. And that includes more than just having discussions about it. And political support like this hinges on a number of factors, civil wars, coups, financial depressions. A lot of different factors can figure into how much political support there is. So clearly the enabling environment is very important. But there is a measure of support that can be given when the state is not in such a fragile position.
Do you think with political support, I just want to probe you a little bit more on that, do you think with political support that there's a danger because RTI can take 2 to 3 years to fully implement, even in the best of times in cases, of political support fatigue? Is it difficult to keep up the political support? And did you notice in the case studies any strategies or any sort of actions that helped maintain the momentum for effective RTI implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. Clearly, it's great if you have a president, a series of presidents that are really fully behind the right to information, or a prime minister. But what's also important is institutionalization of right to information. So the formalization of those practices within the public sector, they're really important for sustaining implementation in times when political support lags. If you have agencies that are accountable to a central nodal agency that is overseeing the process, if you have an external sort of information commissioner who is making sure that appeals are happening and that information is being disclosed. It's these sort of institutional arrangements can be set up and they can operate. It's important to have political support for them. You can't have no political support, but they can still function if they're set up effectively. They can still function when political support is absent. That's very important.
I want to turn now to some more questions that are coming through on the chat. So from Mega Panselkar, I hope, Mega, that I pronounced your name correctly. Since the study was done across country on RTI effectiveness, Mega wants to know, can we get access to the data analysis indicator-wise, plus the entire report of the study? And so maybe I can
Yeah,
respond to this one. So Mega, yes, absolutely. The report's going to be made available. The draft working paper is going to be made available online, and we really want your feedback. We really want your comments. And in addition, the raw data that we've used, the case study publication, is also already available online from our Transparency and Information Management website, which is a public website on the World Bank's public website. And we're going to try something quite novel here as well, in that we have, as Stephanie had explained, we have coded the case study. So the raw data, the case studies are available. We've also created codes of the case studies, and we've done intercoder reliability of the codes. And we're actually going to make our code base publicly available as well, in the spirit of transparency, which is what we're here to support. So all of this data and our synthesis of the data will be made available. And we hope that this will facilitate the global conversation we want to have about right to information effectiveness. So thanks for that question. Another question from Chadwick Noah. Um, Chadwick asks, what do you think accountable accounts for countries that achieve high levels of development, such as Singapore, without the right to know legislation? So, you know, the question really is the right to information, is it necessary for development?
Yeah.
What do you think about this, Stephanie?
Very good question. And this speaks to the third degree outcomes that we were talking about, that we don't quite understand that well, the sort of highest standard of living, really well-delivered services. How does that relate to right to information? We don't quite know. But we do know that with correlation studies, that open government actually correlates very highly with government effectiveness. And these are external sources. I can, if anybody's interested, email me and I can email you that data. Open government does matter on a very macro level. On a very specific public agency level, we like to think that it matters, and I think it does, but we need to do more studies about how it interacts with service delivery and how it impacts service delivery, for example. But there are countries clearly that can achieve very high standards of living without implementing these transparency and accountability mechanisms. But at some point, citizens are going to want to know what's happening. And we can see a little bit of that in the Arab Spring. Access to information is really important. Access to decision making is quite important. So transparency and accountability mechanisms may not be foundational for a higher standard of living, but they certainly do influence that path. And they play a very important role in sustaining development outcomes or sustaining levels of development.
Yes, I think it's a very good point about the Arab Spring. I mean, Tunisia is always held up as an example of this, isn't it? And that it was performing very, very well before the Arab Spring by standards of economic development. I mean, certainly in terms of growth in the country. And there didn't seem to be any inkling on the horizon of what might happen. But because there wasn't an inclusive form of governance, we found that, the situation um, did transpire. The sustainability of that economic growth did decline, and we had, the Arab Spring sparked as a result of that. So I think what we're seeing is that, yes, you can have economic growth. You might be able to achieve poverty reduction, meet those twin goals that are important to the World Bank without the right to information. We believe that the right to information is a fundamental right in itself, and it's good in and of itself. But we also think that, in terms of instrumental value, it promotes the sustainability of the growth and development that occurs in countries. And without it, you can go back several decades with civil unrest occurring. So, but I agree with you that more research needs to be done to really unpack some of those arguments. So another question from Abdelaziz. he's talking about the study, speaking of, and I think you're referring, Abdelaziz, to the case study publication itself, speaking of the citizen. And he's saying, isn't it more accurate to speak of requesters because right to information is irrespective of nationality. So Stephanie, do you have any comments on that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thanks for catching that in the case study volume. We often, that's sort of a word that we use in place of requester, but you're right, it's more accurate to speak of requesters because information should be accessible to all and not just the people who reside in the country. So yes, definitely, and in the presentation we used requester or user because citizen narrows the base down, and there are some instances where in the country, the states, it's a federal system, the states implement right to information laws that only allow residents of that state to request information from state government, which limits the access to information in a way that people hadn't anticipated. So indeed, requesters is a better word, and RTI is irrespective of nationality. It's a very good point.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Here's another question that came in before from Noor Mohammed, Stephanie. And Noor asks, I would be interested to learn about measuring the impact of right to information on service delivery improvement for citizens. I guess you've touched a bit upon that question in talking about the different degrees, but maybe you'd want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Again, measuring impact is difficult, and you need to have a good framework for what you're looking at because it's important that you're looking for information that is relevant. So impact stories often end up being anecdotal and overly narrative. And that's not necessarily helpful if you want to be able to generalize from the impact story. So an analytical focus on impact would be a better way of going about it. But again, this takes time. We need to think about it and discuss the best approaches. So eventually, hopefully, we'll move into studying impact more rigorously because it is a very important part of the puzzle. And it's important to know how that information is being used because not only does it let government know what information might be proactively disclosed, obviating the need for the request process, but it also helps service delivery operators understand how their systems are working and how they can be improved.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention too, in addition to that, that the World Bank has done a little bit of work, hasn't it, on looking at transparency and, for example, public expenditure outcomes in the PET surveys. So these again are available on the World Bank's public website. It's called PETS surveys, and we've recently also done, not published yet, some analysis of the PET surveys and looking at information and its availability and its impact on public expenditure outcomes. And so we hope to share that with you soon as well. It's not directly related to right to information in that the citizens weren't using the right to information mechanisms to request information. It's more generally about the availability of information and its impact on service delivery. But you might be interested in knowing about that as well. So from Soren Davidson, again, this question came in a little earlier. What are the political incentives that could work with the grain in the implementation of right to information laws? And Soren makes the further comment that political will seems like a black box explanation and that we need to unbundle underlying incentives, which you've talked about. So what could some of these incentives be? Do you have any thoughts on Soren's question, Stephanie?
Well, and most definitely, working with the grain means understanding what is actually happening before you attempt to put anything into practice. So a political economy analysis of some sort would be very helpful for understanding who the actors are and how they're going to impact the implementation path and how they can be incorporated in implementation processes effectively. So yes, political will is a black box. It needs to be unbundled. And I would suggest looking at the different actors and looking at the constraints on those actors or incentives to see how they can best be involved in implementation processes. Vicki, I'm sure you might have something else to say
Yeah,
about
well,
that.
I will only just agree with you that I think that political economy analysis, even if it's not, huge undertaking, but you really need to know for each country that you're in, don't you? What are the incentive structures? They'll all be different depending on what country context you find yourself in. There are different dynamics, and really understanding those dynamics is important, isn't it? You need to find that entry point. You need to identify the particular officials that you're going to need to work with. Um, so I think at this point, we might have to start to wrap up. I don't think we have time for any more questions, sadly. I'm so delighted to see that there are so many questions coming, and if we're not able to answer them today, please send us. We'll try and get back to you through other means to respond to your questions, and we welcome a continued dialogue on this. So. At this point, I just want to say, Stephanie, thank you very much for a really, really interesting presentation, rich with information. I hope that our participants have benefited from you sharing this knowledge. And I thank everybody who's participated. It's wonderful to see people from Morocco, from Bangkok, we had people on the line, people from India. So we're delighted that you've joined us today. I just want to also remind you that this is part of a weekly series. We don't always have the e-webinars. These are special, and we thank the E-Institute for hosting this. But we have a weekly open discussion forum, and our next one will be next week in our usual time slot of Thursday at 10 a.m. EST. And in this, we'll look more specifically at a case study of digital record keeping in Estonia. So we'll go into that records management topic. And thanks once again to all of our participants. I'll just end by reminding all of you, if you wouldn't mind, just take a couple of minutes to complete the survey that we have online so that we can get your feedback on this seminar, understand how you found it, understand what other additional information you might have, and plan for future webinars. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Stephanie, do you have any last thoughts?
I just wanted to say thank you, Vicki, for moderating. It's great to have somebody here to help it along. These are great questions. And also to thank the case study authors. The 12 case studies were the basis for the synthesis report, and they all did such a great job. So please do check out that case study volume. It has 12 country case studies from 2012 and 2014. So there's a range of information in there. They're fascinating.
That's
thank
great.
you to them.
Thank you. So fill out that survey, and thanks again for everyone for participating and for your support of this program. See you next time.